Welcome to Buildings and Beyond,
the podcast that explores how we can create a more sustainable built environment
by focusing on efficiency, accessibility, and health.
I'm Robb Aldrich.
And I'm Kelly Westby.
And before we get into this week's episode, we wanted to let you know about a couple of upcoming events. Dylan Martello, who is a Passive House consultant here at SWA, and is really instrumental in putting this podcast together, helping to produce the podcast. He's going to be speaking at both of these conferences, and he'll give you a little bit of info about them.
Thanks, Rob. The first is Building Energy NYC Conference, taking place on October 3rd and 4th in New York City. The conference, which is presented by Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, or NESEA, N-E-S-E-A, has become a staple for professionals and practitioners in the field of high-performance building, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. We have been to the Building Energy conferences for many years now, and my colleagues and I are looking forward to returning for another great event. Visit nesea.org for more info.
Yeah, I've been involved with NESEA for 20 years or so, and really good people, and I've learned tons at NESEA conferences over the years.
Next is the North American Passive House Network Conference and Expo, taking place at the David L. Lawrence Convention Center in Pittsburgh, PA. Join us October 17th through the 21st, where we'll be speaking on a variety of topics related to Passive House. Visit naphnconference.com for more info.
Thanks, Dylan.
Are you interested in becoming a certified Passive House designer or consultant? Check out North American Passive House Network's 5-day training in various locations across the nation, and every other month in New York City. See their website for an updated schedule. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited about today. It's a little bit of an indulgence for me because I am actually working on planning some renovations for my own house. And so I have Srikanth Puttagunta on from Stephen Winter Associates. He's a mechanical engineer and focuses on residential home consulting, mostly on the HVAC and mechanical side. He's also done a lot of residential research initiatives for different programs, Building America, and various other programs. And today we're going to take a little bit of a personal tone and talk about renovations that he's done on his own house. So let's just jump right in. So Sri, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk a little bit about a switch that you had made in your life. We talked. I let everybody know a little bit about your background in the built environment in the residential sector, and you bought a house and turned the tables, and you were the client. So tell me a little bit about what that was like.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was living in a townhouse and had to deal with condo associations and not really being able to touch much in my house, and decided to move out to the burbs. And we ended up purchasing a 1960s split-level home. While it had some nice updates in it from an aesthetic standpoint, it was your typical 1960s home in terms of everything that we love in terms of energy efficiency, health, and so it was an interesting process. One of the main things, this was probably the first time we actually got into being the client. So everything I've done has always been on the consulting side, and it's easy to tell somebody what to do, especially when it's not your money. But in this case, it's both being the client and the consultant, and of course, having to see the bottom dollar. So it was really quite interesting in that aspect, and like every other project, you have to sort of make your selections of what you want to do, what you might do later on, and what you're just going to have to skip for this project. So.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into all of that, but first, do you want to give me a little basic overview of some of the things that you did in your renovations?
Yeah, it's the house itself is right around 1,600 square feet. It is, as I mentioned, a split level. And the main things we focused on originally was, the envelope. So first things were, it had essentially R4 degraded insulation in it. And we were looking at different ways to insulate that, both in the walls and then also looking at the roof. Through the process of doing this, one of the interesting things is we actually found that there was a very large pest infestation in the house. So mice, dead mice, literally everywhere. Roof, ceiling, basement. It was pretty bad, but we figured this is a perfect opportunity. We'll do air sealing. We'll do the insulation. We'll be able to take care of the pest problem as well. So that was the main thing that we did. We did dense packed cellulose into the exterior walls, and then closed spell spray foam in the ceiling. So just because it was, in most cases, a pitched roof, vaulted ceiling, we wanted to get a high enough R value in the ceiling, and so we did it at the roof deck itself. Some of the other things, the home was originally an oil boiler. And when we first were looking for a house, I was absolutely against an oil house. I said, no way. And when we put in the offer for the house, I was standing in the street, and there's a gas line in the street. And I called the utility up. I was like, well, I don't have gas. It's on the street. And they said, no, you don't have gas in your street. I was like, I'm literally standing on the valve. And I took some while, but I finally got them to come out, and they're like, oh, yeah, you have gas. And so we were able to get gas connected to the house. So we did some improvements in terms of the old existing boiler, updating it to tankless boiler. We kept the radiant baseboards. I didn't feel like doing any additional drywall work, so I said, hey, if we want to use it, we can have it. There were some through-wall AC units in the house, but I was looking for something a little better than that. And again, part of trying to air seal through-wall units really don't cut it. So we actually included a multi-port air source heat pump in the house as well. Because it's split level, we really didn't have an opportunity to put ductwork. So using the individual heads allowed us to get zoning as we wanted and meet our cooling needs.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you, I think you told me a story that I thought was really interesting, an anecdote about you had called the people that used to live at your house, and they had some issues with their children had asthma symptoms while they were in the house. And when they left, that they didn't really have those symptoms anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this was when we started doing inspections and everything, and we found all sort of the issues with mice. There was feces everywhere. And so anywhere we were going, we were vacuuming everything up. And that's when I had got some information from the previous homeowners because I was curious about their utility costs and stuff. So I had their information. And I just sort of had an offhanded comment with them to talk about health. And I was just like, it seems like there's a lot of sort of pest issues in the house. Did your kids ever have any issues? And they had talked about sort of their kids, which were I think they were 5, 7 years old. And they said, yeah, they were having a lot of asthma issues. And then I said, I might understand why they're having the asthma issues. And they also just offhandedly mentioned that they sort of were reduced once they moved away. They moved into a new construction house, which didn't have the same issues as their previous house. So it was definitely high on our list to take care of as one of the priorities for any of the work we were doing.
For your own family.
Yep.
And you'd mentioned kind of in the beginning a little bit about challenges with budgeting. Do you want to talk about what specific examples do you have that came up that were issues that you maybe didn't predict in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, one of them, you always under budget. You think everything should be cheaper than it really is, but once you get into it and you see all the details and you want to do it, a high quality job, it ends up taking more than you originally estimate. But one of the big things that I really wanted to originally do was adding exterior rigid insulation to the home. So I figured it's 2x4 walls. Even if I dense pack it, I'm getting into maybe R15. I could do a little better than that by putting an inch of rigid on the exterior. Okay. So it made perfect sense. But once we pulled down the siding and we're starting to look at it, we had done the dense pack of the cellulose from the exterior, actually. We didn't want to actually take down any of the interior drywall.
Okay.
So we were able to do most of it not being so intrusive to the interior of the home. But when doing that, we actually noticed the windows on half of the house were essentially retrofit windows that they installed at a later date, and the way they installed it was actually incorrect. And so we were actually having water that was draining back into the wall cavity. So it wasn't something we were originally anticipating having to deal with in terms of cost.
Wow, yeah.
And so we ended up sort of doing a trade-off there of buying half house of new windows and eliminating the rigid insulation.
Okay, interesting. And did you find big issues? I mean, windows are obviously supposed to keep the water out, not funnel it into the wall cavity. So what was there any major issues from that, or?
We were fortunate. I guess one of the things with old 1960 homes is that they're very leaky. So if they get wet, they dry out pretty quickly.
There you go.
So there was some evidence of water damage, but the real extent of it was really just changing couple pieces of plywood to the exterior. So there wasn't anything drastic.
Right. But obviously the windows added a lot of costs.
Yeah, and especially with us insulating and tightening up the home, it would have been a serious issue moving forward if we would have left it the same way, because it wouldn't have dried out.
Right. And what other, did you look at any monitoring? Do you know how much energy consumption was reduced by your retrofit?
Yeah, so because we're energy geeks, certainly I wanted to know sort of everything about it. So as I mentioned, we reached out to the previous homeowners to get their utility bills. So we actually got 2 years of their utility bills, and they are running roughly $7,000 a year for all their utilities. And we'd done modeling, but I really wanted to know a little deeper how much energy we'd be using. So we had our own utility bills after a year, but I was curious really exactly where we're doing it. So we installed a energy monitoring system on our electric panel, and we took it a little extreme. So rather than just doing the whole house and the solar, we actually went to do every single circuit breaker. Just a little bit of overkill, but I was curious.
Right, great.
And so we ended up getting a lot of interesting data. I can certainly tell the patterns of my family and what they're doing, and what's very typical. But in the end,
tell when your children are out of bed when they're not supposed to be.
I can tell when he's turning on the TV without me knowing.
Side benefits.
But in the end, after the year of monitoring it and looking at the utility bills, we were roughly $1,500 annually. So it was a huge difference.
So 7,000 to 1,500.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, part of that is converting fuel. So we did switch from oil to natural gas, but a large portion of that is energy savings and then solar generation.
Right, that's great. Did you get any incentives for any of the work, solar or otherwise?
So we actually got between state utility incentives and federal tax credit, we got roughly half of the solar cost of the solar system covered by incentives. And then we got probably another 10% of cost for insulation, windows, high efficiency mechanical equipment. And one of the interesting things is my house was the one case study that we used to get the Connecticut multi-port heat pump incentive.
Oh, wow.
So prior to that, they only did a single air source heat pump, just a one-to-one unit. That's what they incentivized. And I actually had a single outdoor unit to multiple heads inside. And they said, well, you just get the incentive for one.
Oh, wow, that's great.
That doesn't make sense. And then they said, well, you can put as many one-to-one combinations as you want and get the incentive for each one that way.
Right.
It's like, what's the difference? A multi-port or a single, it should essentially be the same. And I don't want to have 4 outdoor condensing units for no reason. And so we actually worked with the utilities to revise their incentive program, and we got incentivized for it.
There you go. That's great. Benefits of being the client and the consultant at the same time.
Yeah.
And what else did you do anything in terms of automation? We hear a lot about, smart thermostats and learning thermostats. And did you do anything in that world?
Absolutely not. I have enough frustrations in the day dealing with my computer at work and having to do control, delete, and resets and network issues. And when I get home, I really don't want to have to deal with another computer. I like a simple light switch. If I want light on, I'll turn it on. We kept the most basic thermostats. They are programmable. I don't program them. We did sort of all the work to make it an efficient house, and I just set it to what temperature I want, and it runs. So
Do you set it back manually during the day when you're at work?
No.
Okay.
I mean, we set a higher cooling set point than probably most people, but I like it that way. So we're not overcooling it during the day, but it's just a simple, I want it at 68 degrees in the winter, 77 degrees in the summer. Let it be.
Awesome. And is there any difference between before you did this retrofit yourself and after in how you work with your clients or recommendations that you make to them?
Certainly. Working with the Department of Energy's Building America program, it's very much heavily focused on energy savings. So looking at site or source energy, but it's BTU saved, kWh saved. And that's sort of the main metric that we're using. And a lot of times for clients, it was always return on investment, simple paybacks. Everything was sort of a energy saved aspect to it. And going through this process, especially on sort of the health side of it, made it very clear to me the way we present the value of a lot of these improvements needs to change. And so certainly health is one of the key ones that I focus on when trying to explain certain decisions, and it may not have a direct monetary payback,
Right.
but productivity, long-term health, there's a huge value to that. And then the other one, certainly comfort. It's a huge one that we always want. You can always get comfortable with a house that sort of doesn't work exactly as you want after a couple of years, but why? If you can make it comfortable for you rather than you adjusting to it, take the time to do it. And then the last one is really one I hadn't really thought about before was noise. Making stuff a little tighter, getting more insulation in the walls, the sound level significantly changes also. And so, especially with a lot of our high-end clients, noise control or abatement is just as important as a lot of the other aspects that we're trying to pitch to them. And so sort of taking all those together, you can make a much fuller case to make a large investment into projects rather than just focusing on energy.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I've definitely come across a lot more of a focus on noise recently, and I don't know if our equipment has gotten noisier or people are just more
neighbors.
attuned. Yeah. Or are less comfortable with just giving into the noisy equipment. So that's a really interesting anecdote. Sort of speaking about noise and other concerns, was there anything that you didn't do that you regret, that you might go back and change later, or?
I mean, one we talked about was the exterior rigid insulation. And again, for that one, I think I'd do it more so than anything. I mean, I'm comfortable in the house, but from some other projects I've been on, certainly there's a noise benefit of having that exterior rigid insulation. So I've gotten used to it, but every morning we're very much woken up by the birds chirping outside. And it's like, well, it's sort of a nice alarm clock, but sometimes it's like, don't really want that on a Saturday or Sunday morning.
Yeah, you want to wait for your own alarm clock.
The other big one is probably actually one that I've done quite a bit of research on, and so that was actually our kitchen range. The previous homeowners had done pretty extensive update on the kitchen, so I was, it's done. I don't have to do anything more to it. But it was a microwave recirc fan. And so it's beautifully laid out, but it has a microwave over the range. And so I was like, what are we going to do here? And it's a vaulted ceiling, so it's, running a pipe also through the vault, it's just not aesthetically going to look nice. But we were able to figure out a way to duct it to the outside within the wall cavity.
Great.
So it's still a microwave range, but it is our microwave range hood, but it is ducted to the outside. So it's an improvement. It's not perfect, but it's an improvement.
Yeah. And I would just bring up at this point that I think it was NREL study that looked at particulates and exhaust and things given off by everybody's range.
Yeah,
and
aldehydes, particulate matter, formaldehyde. Yeah.
And that they recommend a minimum of, I think, 200 CFM exhaust.
Somewhere in 200 to 300 CFM range, a variable speed one, but sort of on the max range. If you have that along with the very good capture hood, so you really want a hood that extends all the way over your burners. If you can do that, that CFM range works fairly well.
Great, yeah, and I think they showed that a significant number of houses in the state of New York, I think, were the range was not operating properly. So
range doesn't operate properly, and the people don't turn them on. I mean, for it to be effective, you got to turn it on.
That is an excellent point. That's great. And speaking of ranges, what are your thoughts on induction stoves?
So this is one
Or
that's
oven,
it's a
stoves.
project that I'm still trying to convince my wife of. But we do have, it originally was a propane range, and we converted it back to natural gas once we got that line.
Great.
But 2 out of the 4 burners don't work. And so we're like, it's time to replace it. And doing sort of the studies, looking at different things, I've sort of gone towards the induction idea. So we don't allow combustion, burning of combustion gases anywhere in our house. It's all sealed combustion at this point, except for ranges, just because we like it for our cooking aesthetic. And so we're really looking at moving to an induction range. The main difference really is the pot selection and the amount of stuff that's available now. I even have a cast iron pan that works for induction. So I think that's the route we're going to be going, and it will take care of some of the additional pollutants that we have to deal with when cooking.
Right, great. Yeah, and I think gas stoves are a big issue with Passive House. And I know that we have another episode on Passive House, and Lois is not a big fan of those either. So, and I also want to reference a little bit that was something that we've talked about is the value of these improvements. And I know you wrote a blog post about the value of energy efficiency improvements on your house in terms of market value. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your thoughts are?
I guess the value or the lack of value. It's one of the things that Department of Energy, the appraisal associations, they're all starting to get on board with this. The number of homes that have now been rated as Energy Star has gotten into a capacity where it's starting to make an impact in the market. So people are actually considering HERS index, energy efficiency, and seeing a benefit from it. So you're starting to see it creep into stuff. But you certainly have still the case of aesthetics, upgrades, being the primary driver of what the price is. I just read an article the other day, if you paint your front door a gray-blue color, you'll add $6,000 worth of value to your house.
Wow.
And I was like, but I just put, a generator. Did I get $6,000 worth of benefit back? Or I improved my boiler, and I might get the cost of it back, but did I get $6,000 back? It really hasn't got to that point yet. But the bigger part, I think, that's going to start getting into it is as we get more familiar with the health aspects of stuff, that's going to have a huge impact on how we really value these homes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'll end on, if we are talking in 5 years on this podcast, when we're still around, of course.
When we're talking 5 years from now.
What will we be talking about then?
Well, I'm guessing we're going to all be living in domes that are electrochromic windows that will change. You
have a lot of big hopes for the next 5 years.
We're going to be talking about the same stuff. The big part that we're doing is rather than being sort of on the leading edge and the early adopters, it's going to be mainstream. So Energy Star is now getting more of a foothold. You'll then start seeing passive house, zero energy ready homes. All those things are going to start becoming what is demanded by the market rather than the nice extra feature that somebody does. And that's really where I think the market's going to be going.
That's awesome. Great. Thank you so much for being on Buildings and Beyond.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Buildings and Beyond. For more information about the topics discussed today, visit www.swinter.com/podcast and check out the episode's show notes. Buildings and Beyond is brought to you by Stephen Winter Associates. We provide energy, green building, and accessibility consulting services to improve the built environment. Our professionals have led the way since 1972 in the development of best practices to achieve high-performance buildings. Our production team for today's episode includes Dylan Martello, Alex Mirable, and myself, Heather Breslin. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.